Hello, in this class we're going to look at how PHP can do some maths. Obviously in a programming language we would expect to have to do some work with numbers. PHP is a loosely typed language. That means it doesn't get very hung up on types. So in some programming languages you have to be very careful. Is the number an integer? Is it a real number? Is it a very big integer? PHP not so much. So PHP is very flexible, very loose with types. That can be good and bad. In programming languages that are not very strict with the programmer, the programmer has to take on the responsibility to not do crazy stupid stuff. So you do need to be careful there. So we're just going to look at some of the numerical operators in PHP and some of the logical operators as well. The logical operators will be very important later on when we look at if statements. But we won't be doing a whole lot of maths in PHP really. It's not a language you would use for number crunching or anything like that. Now the bulk of these are fairly obvious, but we'll go through them anyway. The first mathematical operator we look at is plus. So we can say in an expression 3 plus 2, and that'll give us 5, obviously enough. Similarly, we have subtraction, the minus sign there. 7 minus 3 is going to give us 4. Like most programming languages, we don't use x for multiplication because that could be confused for the letter x. So we use a star for multiplication. So 7 multiplied by 3 is 21. And we have this slash here for division. So nothing strange or startling there. 45 divided by 5 would be 9. PHP does not have a separate type of division for integers and for reals. That's because it's fairly relaxed about types anyway, so there's no need for that. Some programming languages there would be integer division where the answer can only be an integer, and real division then where you could have fractions, but PHP doesn't mind. This operator here, modulus, is an interesting one. You would be surprised how many times you end up using this actually. It's one of those strange ones that kind of gets you out of a hole very often. So modulus, or mod as we usually call it, is the remainder left over after integer division. So 27 divided by 5 is 5 remainder 2. And that's where the 2 comes from. So that's mod. Now, next up then we have these two operators that we see a lot in modern or more recent programming languages. And this is an increment, so 27 plus plus will evaluate to 28, and we have a decrement. 27 minus minus will evaluate to 26. Okay, but these last two ones we're going to look at some more in a bit more detail because they do some freaky stuff. But first up, let's just see how we would use numerical operators in some PHP. So here we have variable a is 3, variable b gets 5, variable x gets variable a plus variable b, and we output variable x. So first line here, variable a gets 3, so a stores 3. Variable b here gets 5, so we have a variable box, we put 5 in it. Now when we use multiple variables then in an expression, what happens is they will get evaluated. So here we have on the right part of this assignment statement here, we have variable a plus variable b, so that works out to be 8. So whatever the answer then is on the right hand side, whatever that works out to be gets put into variable x. And so variable x holds 8, so when we echo 8, we get 8 out there. Now nothing strange or startling in that there. So that kind of thing should be familiar to most of you already. Let's have a look at this fairly straightforward piece of code here. So variable a gets 3. Then we're evaluating variable a plus 1, so that works out to be 4. So then 4 gets put into variable a. So a now has been overwritten with the new value. So a variable can only hold one value at a time, and if you assign something to a variable, the value that was in there will be overwritten and the new value we put in there. and then we can say echo variable a, which will output 4. Again, fair enough. Now, if we wanted to use the plus plus, the increment notation here, we can once again say variable a gets 3. Now here we're saying then increment variable a. So variable a here gets 1 added to it straight away. And then we can echo variable a, so that'll output 4. Next variation here, getting a bit trickier. So once again, variable a gets 3, so we put 3 in that value there. And I would say echo increment a. So what happens here? Well, we increment a, well, we output 4. Okay? But when we do that, we also update the value in variable a. So merely saying a++ doesn't just evaluate what that would be, it actually changes the value. And so that's tricky. So if we were to say echo a+1, it would work out what a+1 is and output that, but it wouldn't change a. But when you do a++, when you do the increment there, it actually changes the value of the variable. So that's a really not unpredictable. I suppose when you know about it, you can predict it, but it's a tricky behavior that you have to watch out for. So it's not the same as saying a+1, because it actually changes a in doing that. Now, there are actually two forms of this in PHP. On the left here, we're saying I gets 3, and then we're saying echo ++ variable I. And so what that'll do is it'll add 1 to I, and then print out 4. On the right then, we have the version that we're more familiar with. So again, I gets 3. But if we say echo I++, this prints 3 and then adds 1. Now, you know, you do wonder why someone lost any sleep over figuring out that you needed 2 different kinds of this. You know, I think 0 kinds of this would be enough. Actually, I'm not a huge fan of this particular syntax, because I think it causes confusion. But if you see this somewhere, you certainly need to recognize what's going on. And if someone is doing ++ $I, for example, they need the new value to be shown. It's not enough that they wanted to increment it, they want to show it as well. Okay, so if someone is reaching for ++, there's something in particular, something special going on there, because that's unusual. And they're going to a lot of trouble to do that. So you need to get not tripped up by that. In general though, I would recommend you not use any of these. No. So if we look here at what's going on, we have $a, so variable a gets 3. And then we echo a++, which will show us 3. And then if we show a again, we'll see that a is now 4. But the echo a++ showed us the old value and then incremented it. Whereas if we look at the ++ a variant, here we again put 3 into a, and this time we say echo ++ $a. This time it'll increment it and show us the new value. So when we do echo a the next time around, it's just 4. So if you see those, don't get stuck, don't get confused. Now, so we also then in PHP have your common or garden comparisons. So if we look at these one by one, there's nothing particularly unusual there apart from the last one. So if we want to check if A equals B, for example, we use A equals equals. So we need those two equal signs there when we are comparing two values. That's so it's not ever confused then with the assignment statement, which just uses one equals sign. So that's something where people get stuck sometimes. Their program isn't working and they're not sure why. That's because they said, if A equals B, something like that. But you need the two equal signs to make that to work. For not equal, we would say $equals. Okay, and then we have the greater than sign, the less than sign. We have the greater than or equal sign. Sometimes when you say greater than, you actually mean greater than or equal. So wherever you are about to put in a greater sign, just have a think. Do you really mean greater or greater than or equal? So for example, if someone needs to be over 18 to get a drink, well, it's not if age is greater than 18. You actually mean if age is greater than or equal to 18. So have a think. The same then for less than or equal. Sometimes you need to watch out for that. This last one here then is an unusual operator. Okay, this is called the tertiary operator, and this is basically and sort of an if type scenario. I'll show it to you here in more detail. So there are three expressions that form part of this tertiary expression. So the first part, that's in brackets before the question mark, that expression gets evaluated, and that will turn out to be either true or false. So it could be like A less than B, or it could be D greater than or equal to P, whatever the case may be. So that will turn out to be true or false. If that turns out to be true, then the expression that comes after the question mark but before the colon, that gets evaluated, and then that's the result that's returned. If the expression before the question mark turns out to evaluate to false, well then the expression after the colon and before the semicolon is the one that gets evaluated and returned. So in this example here, we have two variables. One is wages and one is costs. And so if wages are greater than costs, so that turns out to be true. So if wages greater than costs is true, well then this expression here is going to evaluate to party time, and it's going to echo, going to display party time. However, if wages greater than costs turns out to not be true, then this is going to evaluate to guacamole costs extra, and that's what's going to be output. So this can be used in place of an if statement, which is something we're going to look at probably in the next class. And it's a little shorthand. If you're familiar with it, it's great. I find it personally it's a bit cryptic. I'm not a huge fan of it, but PHP has lots of shortcuts, and again, if you're familiar with this and you know how it works, it's not a big deal, but it can, I think, when you see it in code, be a little bit confusing. So those are the numerical operators. Sorry, whoops, there you go. So that's all those there. The first few are no problem, and then this last one here is the only one that's anyway tricky. Next up now we're going to look at the Boolean operators. So you can combine expressions. So you can say A less than B and C less than D. For example, you can have a complex combination of things that would evaluate to true or false. So something would evaluate to true or false, you can combine that with other things that would evaluate to true or false, and the result of those will also be true or false. So in PHP we have AND operators, and this can be ampersand, ampersand, or you can use AND. So that's handy. Some programming languages would use ampersand, ampersand only, and some would use and only, and PHP is flexible. You can have your pick there, so that's convenient. We also then have the OR operator, so that's bar bar, which is usually on the bottom right-ish of your keyboard, the bar symbol, or you can just say OR, and then the exclamation mark is for not. The AND operator behaves pretty much as you would expect it to operate in English. If you're used to using AND in English, then it's no problem. So if A is true and B is true, then A and B is true. But if any one of them is false, if A is false or B is false, then A and B is going to be false. So only when A is true and B is true is A and B true. And if we look at OR, if A is true and B is true, then A or B is true. If A is true and B is false, then A or B is true. If A is false and B is true, then A or B is true. And if A is false and B is false, if A is false and B is false, then A or B is false. So this kind of logic, which we use every day now, which is so common really even in our day-to-day life, this all was devised way back by George Boole, who's probably one of the most famous Quark people ever. And so these kind of operations and this kind of logic is named after him: Boolean logic, Boolean operations. So last up then we just have the NOT operator, and so if A is true, then not A is false, and if A is false, then not A is true. Now PHP has AND, OR, and NOT. Some programming languages have more, but actually if you think really hard about it, you'll see that A and OR and NOT, they make a complete set. In fact, you could get by with just a NOT and an OR, or even a NOT and an AND if you were really stuck. But anyway, so that's the set of those there. So when we're combining these then, or when we're trying to express complex circumstances or different situations, we might combine them in different ways. So in these examples here, all of these variables hold either true or false. So if we want to figure out whether we should bring an umbrella or not, we could say umbrella gets raining and not lift. So if it's raining and you don't have a lift, well then umbrella should be true. Now if raining was false, well then we would have false and something. Doesn't really matter because that would turn out to be false, and so you wouldn't need an umbrella. So if it's not raining, you don't need an umbrella. No. If lift is true, then not lift would be false. And so if it was raining and you had a lift, you would get raining, which is true, and lift is true, so not lift would be false. So you'd have true and false, which would give you false. So you don't need an umbrella if you have a lift and it's raining. We could also say umbrella gets raining and not lift and not bus. So if there's a bus, you don't need an umbrella. If you have a lift, you don't need an umbrella. And of course, if it's not raining, you don't need an umbrella. If we look here at the next example, the third one down, this is saying the same thing actually. So you can combine ands and ors in different ways to express the same idea. So once again, in this one, we're saying umbrella gets raining. So it needs to be raining for you to be even considering whether you're getting an umbrella or not. If it's not raining, that's false. If raining is false, you don't need an umbrella. So, but if it's raining and you don't have a lift or a bus ride. So here, if you have a lift, this will be true. Or if you have a bus ride, it'll be true. Or indeed, if you have a lift and a bus ride, if you have both of them, it'll still be true. Okay? So that part of the expression there would be true in those circumstances, and so not then true would be false. So you don't need an umbrella if you have a lift or a bus ride. We might decide that we're going to walk, provided we have the time, and of course it's not raining. So we could say walk gets on time and not raining. So it's important to get your head round Boolean expressions. They're very important. They're a very important part of programming, and you need to be able to specify precisely the scenario that you're thinking about. But for the most part, they behave as you would expect them to behave, just from the usage of those words in English. But of course, the brackets and the knots and the way they're combined together sometimes can be a little bit confusing. And sometimes it can be shorter to say the exact opposite of what you want and then put a knot in front of it rather than specify all of the things that you want. So one last thing that we want to look at is the use of constants. So a variable stores data. So a variable is a data store, and we can change the value stored in a variable during the course of the program. Now, there are scenarios where we know what the value is going to be in advance, and it's not going to change during the running of the program. So in those scenarios, we should use constants instead of variables. So when we're specifying a constant, the name we give it doesn't include a $sign. That's the first thing. And the rules then that for naming constants are the same as those for variables, except by convention we give them uppercase names, just to make them stand out in the code and to make it clear that they're constants. Now, we can't use constants then in the mixed strings. So you know those quoted strings, the double quote strings where you can include a variable name and it'll be substituted as it's going out the door. You can't do that with constants. And that's because in the absence of the $sign, the PHP doesn't know that it's not just the letters that you're using. It doesn't know not to take it literally. And then the final rule is that Booleans can't be constants. So you can't have a constant that's true or false. Okay. The syntax is fairly straightforward. So we would say define, and then we have in brackets the name of the constant. So in this case, pi would be assigned 3.41, or we might define VAT to be 21. And then in the code, we can use pi or we can use VAT, just like we would a variable in any of our calculations or whatever. Like I said, the only exception is you can't do variable substitution with it. And the reason we do this is that it makes the code neater and tidier. And also, can you imagine if throughout your program you had hard-coded 21 as the VAT rate, and then in a fit of generosity the government decided that it was reducing the VAT rate to 19%, you would have to go through all of the lines of code where you did say 21 and change those to 19. So that would be very inefficient and very clumsy. Also, wherever you see a 21, it doesn't necessarily mean that that should go to a 19. There might be other 2 1s in your code, and so you would have to make sure that that's not what you're talking about. You couldn't just do a find and replace. Whereas if you put define VAT21 at the start of your code, you can talk about the VAT rate wherever you want, whenever you want, included in your calculations, and everything will be great. And then if it changes, you can at the start of the code just change it from 21 to 19. And everything else will be fine. Something like pi obviously is never going to change. Pi is always going to be pi. And so this is constants, and they are very useful. And it's considered good practice to use them where appropriate. You would never take your constants and then change them. Okay, if you're changing the value in your constants in the code, then they shouldn't be constants in the first place. But using constants is a very good idea when appropriate, and it's considered good practice. Okay, so that's numbers and logical operators in PHP. Nothing strange or startling there really. I'm very unfond of the way the increments work and the postfix and prefix increments and decrements. Personally, I think they're best avoided. I think it's better to just say x gets x plus 1 if you want to increment something, and then there's perfect clarity about what it would be at any one time. But certainly if you see those things in other people's code, you need to know what they're talking about. But me personally, I think just best avoid it.